In the winter of 1933, the readers of the Lincoln Star opened their morning newspaper to find a small article with an unusual headline: "Doctor takes eggs, corn, and milk for fees." It described a physician from Lancaster County, Nebraska, who continued to treat patients even after money had vanished from daily life. The Great Depression had reached its darkest years, and across the plains people no longer carried coins or bills but sacks of grain, jars of milk, and baskets of eggs. The article did not mention his first name, but the story was familiar to thousands of rural families. Similar scenes unfolded across the Midwest, where doctors who once charged for their visits now worked for whatever their patients could spare. Some received potatoes, others a few logs of firewood. Medicine had become part of the barter economy that kept entire communities alive. In these years, every visit, every bandage, every childbirth became an act of quiet defiance against collapse. The physician from Nebraska represented more than a local curiosity. He was part of a generation of rural doctors who refused to let poverty erase the meaning of care. Compassion had become a new kind of currency, sustaining both the healer and the healed. The story of the man who traded medicine for food revealed the truth about the Depression itself: that survival was not only an economic struggle but a moral one. By 1932, the economy of the American Midwest had reached a breaking point. The collapse of agricultural prices turned once stable farming towns into zones of quiet desperation. Wheat that had sold for more than $1 a bushel before the crash now brought less than 40 cents. Families who had borrowed to buy tractors or seed lost their land to the banks, and within months entire counties were covered with foreclosed farms. When the banks themselves began to fail, cash vanished from circulation. Even those who still had jobs were often paid in goods or in paper notes that could not be redeemed. The Depression reduced money to an abstraction, and with it disappeared access to almost every essential service, including health care. Illness did not pause for economics. Children still caught pneumonia, farmers still broke bones in the fields, and women still gave birth on cold kitchen floors. Yet clinics and hospitals across the plains stood half empty, their staff unpaid and their shelves bare. The federal government offered no medical assistance, and the Social Security Act that would appear later in the decade excluded health coverage entirely. In many counties, a trained physician might be the only source of care within 50 miles. Without public systems to rely on, the survival of a community often depended on local improvisation, on midwives, neighbors with rudimentary training, or the few doctors who refused to close their doors. For thousands of families, the boundary between sickness and recovery narrowed to a single question: whether anyone remained willing to help when money no longer mattered. In the early 1930s, America lived at the edge of endurance. The Depression reached every city, but its toll was deepest in the countryside. Across the plains, families who once produced abundance began to live from harvest to harvest, feeding themselves with what little the soil could still give. Dust storms stripped the fields bare and left the barns empty. In towns from Nebraska to Kansas, the cash economy simply stopped. People exchanged what they had: eggs for flour, milk for firewood, labor for rent, and this logic soon extended to medicine. Physicians who remained in their posts accepted the same form of trade, recording each transaction in meticulous hand. In the archives of Nebraska and Iowa survive notebooks that read like a dialogue between hunger and duty. Delivery, paid with potatoes; visit, 1 dozen eggs; extraction, 2 quarts of milk. These entries reveal not charity but survival, both for patient and doctor. Rural physicians had families to feed, fuel to buy, and no access to steady income. Their offices, often a room in their homes, smelled of disinfectant mingled with grain and livestock from the goods their patients brought. Medicine had joined the barter network that held small communities together when formal markets collapsed. In the absence of currency, these quiet exchanges became one of the last functioning systems of value in the country, preserving both the dignity of care and the fragile health of rural America. The turning point came in the spring of 1933, when the banking crisis swept through the Midwest and the last traces of cash disappeared almost overnight. In Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas, entire communities found themselves unable to withdraw even a few dollars from their savings. The government's declaration of a national bank holiday, meant to stabilize the system, froze every account for weeks. For rural doctors, this moment marked a quiet but decisive change. They could no longer issue bills or expect payment that would arrive in currency. Across the region, physicians began to accept whatever their patients could offer. In Lancaster County, a doctor who had once kept meticulous financial records began adding small notes in the margins of his ledger. Paid in milk, paid in corn, no charge. His example echoed that of others whose stories appeared in local newspapers such as the Lincoln Star and the Omaha World-Herald. Reports described doctors making house calls through blizzards and dust storms, carrying their own supplies and returning home with baskets of produce instead of coins. What had begun as isolated gestures soon became a shared understanding between physicians and the communities they served. There was no formal agreement, no declaration of charity, only the recognition that medicine had to continue even when the economy stood still. The collapse of the monetary system forced people to rebuild trust as their only form of exchange, and through that trust the bond between doctor and patient grew stronger than any contract. Each day rural physicians set out along unpaved roads that cut through the frozen fields of the Midwest. Their cars were often aging Ford Model A or Model T vehicles, repaired again and again with salvaged parts. The journeys could stretch for miles between isolated farms, and in winter they traveled with chains on the tires and blankets over their laps to guard against the cold. A typical day's work was a succession of kitchen tables and barn rooms converted into makeshift clinics. Doctors treated infections, set broken bones, and delivered children by the light of kerosene lamps when electricity was unavailable. They carried small black bags filled with bandages, morphine, and stethoscopes, refilled only when supplies could be traded from a pharmacist willing to accept grain or firewood in return. In their notebooks they recorded each visit with the precision of an accountant, the name of the patient, the illness, and the form of payment, if any. The entries read like fragments of rural life rather than commerce. Mrs. Olson, childbirth, a few jars of preserves, Mr. Harris, pneumonia, 1 sack of vegetables. Sometimes they added quiet annotations such as, to pay after harvest, or no charge. These ledgers, many of which survive in historical archives, show a profession transformed by necessity. The physician's duty had expanded beyond medicine into a moral practice that held communities together when everything else was falling apart. In a society where currency had failed, the Hippocratic Oath had become its own economy, and the value of care was measured not in dollars but in gratitude. The years of barter medicine tested the endurance of the doctors as much as the patients they served. Constant travel over rutted roads in every season left many of them exhausted and ill. Fuel was expensive and often rationed, and some physicians walked long distances when their cars broke down. The reports of the American Medical Association from 1934 noted that nearly 1/4 of rural doctors lived in conditions little better than those of their poorest patients. Malnutrition was common among them, especially during the harsh winters of the Dust Bowl years when crops failed and livestock died. Their families shared the same limited food supply, surviving on cornmeal, milk, and whatever the neighbors could spare. Equipment wore out, medical supplies ran low, and payments that were promised after harvest sometimes never arrived. The economic collapse blurred the line between caregiver and sufferer. Many physicians treated hundreds of cases of influenza and pneumonia each year while battling their own fatigue and illness. There are accounts of doctors collapsing on their rounds or being confined to bed while patients continued to call at their doors. Those who could have left for cities rarely did, knowing that their absence would leave entire counties without medical care. For them, the profession had become an act of endurance rather than survival. In letters and public statements of the time, several doctors described their decision in simple terms: that duty did not end when money disappeared. Their persistence embodied the ethical core of Depression-era medicine, proving that compassion could survive even when the body and the economy could not. The stories of doctors who treated patients for food or supplies began to circulate far beyond their own towns. Local newspapers across Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa published short reports celebrating what they called human medicine, describing physicians who refused to close their doors despite the absence of money. The Lincoln Star, the Des Moines Register, and the Omaha World-Herald all carried similar accounts between 1933 and 1935. One article mentioned a rural doctor whose kitchen shelves were stacked with jars of preserves from grateful families. Another described patients who mended fences or repaired roofs for their physicians as payment. These reports spread through wire services to other states, and the idea of barter medicine became both a symbol of hardship and a model of resilience. In some regions, small networks of doctors informally exchanged services among themselves, trading labor and equipment instead of cash. A physician who had extra medicine might give it to a colleague who could repay by providing fuel or transportation. Such cooperation created a web of mutual aid that extended beyond medicine into the moral fabric of rural life. Churches and local relief groups began organizing barter fairs where people could trade food, tools, and even professional help. The doctor's willingness to work without direct payment lent legitimacy to these efforts and encouraged others to act in the same spirit. Their examples showed that compassion could function as an organizing principle when institutions failed. In the larger narrative of the Great Depression, these rural physicians stood as proof that small acts of cooperation could sustain entire communities when formal systems of support collapsed. In the years that followed the Depression, many of the physicians who had practiced barter medicine returned to a world where cash once again held value. Yet the memory of those desperate years never faded. Their handwritten ledgers, filled with notations of payment in the everyday goods of survival, survived in attics and family trunks. Some of these records were later donated to state museums and historical societies in Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa. The Nebraska History Museum in Lincoln preserves one such ledger, its pages yellowed and marked with entries like, "Paid with potatoes," and "Repaid with kindness." For historians, these simple lines became rare evidence of moral endurance in an economic catastrophe. They revealed not just the transactions of medicine but the persistence of trust between people when the structures of society had collapsed. After World War II, the nation's medical system modernized, hospitals expanded, and insurance programs gradually emerged, yet many rural doctors who had lived through the 1930s continued to speak of those years as the most honest period of their work. In interviews recorded decades later, they described a sense of purpose that no amount of financial stability could replicate. The patients who had once brought food in place of money often remained lifelong friends, sending letters of gratitude long after prosperity returned. In historical reflection, the story of barter medicine came to represent more than a survival mechanism. It embodied a vision of community built on reciprocity and faith. It stood as a quiet counterpoint to the larger narrative of economic failure, reminding future generations that even in the absence of wealth, a society could preserve its humanity. The story of barter medicine revealed a truth that statistics and recovery plans could not capture. It showed that morality itself could become an economic force when all others failed. The physicians who worked through the Great Depression did not seek recognition or reform. They simply refused to measure care in dollars. Their actions restored meaning to a profession that had been stripped of security, and reminded the nation that compassion could function as infrastructure. In a society obsessed with productivity, they redefined value as the willingness to serve. When the market collapsed, they demonstrated that a community's survival depended not on wealth but on reciprocity. The eggs, grain, and milk exchanged for medical treatment were more than substitutes for money. They were symbols of trust circulating through the veins of a broken economy. Historians later viewed this period as evidence that ethics could endure economic ruin. The doctor's decisions carry no ideology, only the conviction that life itself remained priceless. Their quiet defiance turned medicine into an act of faith, preserving the human connection between those who healed and those who suffered. In the long memory of the Depression, their legacy endured as proof that compassion was not a luxury of prosperity, but the foundation of civilization. They reminded the modern world that progress could never be measured solely in currency or technology, but in the moral choices people made when either could save them